I couldn't do anything as a therapist. It was that moment where I started to realize like, no, this is not what I want to do. And this is not therapy. When I start working with someone, it's not about fixing, it's about getting to know who is this person. I was usually expected to be an expert or the only person of color, the only queer person. So a lot of times it did feel very lonely and very isolating.
Well, I would like to welcome our guest today at She Is Mother. This is Luis Cornejo. He is a queer, first-generation Guatemalan and Mexican-American, licensed marriage and family therapist and certified sex therapist based in Los Angeles. As the founder of Queer Magic Entertainment and co-owner of Psychosocial Therapy, Luis blends mental health advocacy with creative expression, focusing on uplifting the LGBTQ plus and BIPOC communities. Welcome, Luis. I'm so happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Arellano. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Well, let's get started. Luis, what I'd like to do is just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and about your journey.
Yeah, of course. So, whenever I get asked that question, I'm always like, thinking like, how far back do I go? Where do I begin? But let's see. I guess, in a nutshell, I was born and raised in LA. Both my parents are immigrants and I'm first generation, first to go to college, first to get a master's degree, first to start their own business. I mean, a lot of firsts, for me, especially because, I didn't really have a lot of models for where I'm at now. And so I'm still in that place of trying to figure out what it is that I want in life, while at the same time feeling a lot more assured of what I don't want in life, which is wonderful. So it's an exciting time, but definitely had to figure out a lot of things on my own. I was pretty much raised in dominantly the Guatemalan culture. So I would say that, yes, I'm half Mexican, half Guatemalan, but a lot of my cultural practices, foods, and like even words in Spanish I use are more Guatemalan on my mom's side. I grew up with lots of family, lots of cousins. So very much someone that I think had a traditional Latino upbringing. And, as someone that identifies as queer, it definitely didn't come. I mean, I knew from a young age, but it definitely took a while before I had words for it. And so even though it was a very traditional upbringing, there were definitely a lot of I think, moments in my life that were not very traditional. And so I had to learn a lot about myself on my own in terms of identity, but then also, like I said, navigating life here in the US as first generation with education and lots of areas, even in my career. So that's a little bit about me. Right now, I'm currently living in Los Angeles with my partner of 16 years and my 2 fur babies. We met up in the Bay Area when I was still in college. And so it's been a very wonderful long-term relationship. And I think at this moment, I have been really focusing on my private practice, which I launched about 4 years ago, specifically to work with the queer community and BIPOC communities in general. I was really exhausted from being in spaces where I didn't feel aligned with the work that I was doing. And so it took a big jump, but I took that leap of faith 4 years ago, and I've loved it ever since. So that's what I do now, full-time private practice, where I get to do the work I love. And 3 years ago, I also started to pivot more into fashion. And so that's another side of the work that I do now. And the wonderful thing is that it's intersected, because a lot of the mental health work I do really connects with the fashion work that I do. And so I like to think that I bring a very different dynamic to that industry, where I'm not just someone that started in fashion or that has always been in fashion or, that just focused on fashion, but really coming in with a mental health lens to empower and support people who want to also self-express and who want to be creative, regardless of whether they are what's considered, ideal in the fashion and beauty industries, because I think my work centers on dismantling those oppressive narratives. So that's where I'm at right now. I mean, it definitely has been a journey to get me here. I'm going to be 39 this year, and I'm definitely looking forward to the next years. I think the next 10 years, especially because I feel like I've finally started to really know what I want from life. And that has felt good. And at the same time, I don't know how I'm going to get there. So I think it's all exciting, kind of just seeing the transitions and transformations from my upbringing to my early teen years to, later young adult life to now, right? Really being a full-fledged adult, as I like to consider myself now. Finally.
I'm excited to have this conversation, Luis. There's several things that have really got my ears perked up. One of the things, I was just doing the math as you were sharing your journey so far, and what's interesting is that you and I have a lot of overlap in our journeys. I know that I'm significantly older than you are, but even the numbers, you said that you took the leap about 4 years ago and went into private practice. And so what's interesting is about almost exactly the same age, I did the same thing. I was in my mid to late 30s, and I did the exact same leap for exactly the same reason. I just got tired of being in spaces where it was a weird juxtaposition. It felt like I did not belong, yet at the same time, it was a great burden to bear when I was expected to be the representative of the entire Latino population and queer population. And so, it's interesting that you and I have similar journeys. Now, I'm not a first generation. My family has been here for hundreds of years, yet I'm also the first in terms of going to college, not having role models, not having mentors, not having, even in my college experience, not having mentors that were people of color. And so what fascinates me about this conversation is, what does it look like? First of all, what is the difference or the journey look, how it looks different 20 years, in a 20-year span? And how does it look the same? Quite frankly, there might be a lot of similarities. There might be things that haven't changed.
No, absolutely. And I love that you're sharing, because I think otherwise we wouldn't really know, right, how change has occurred and how it hasn't. And there's definitely a lot of what you just said that I still experience myself, which was being in spaces where I was usually expected to be an expert or the only person of color, the only queer person. So a lot of times it did feel very lonely and very isolating, even in spaces where there were so many people. I mean, now in private practice, it's lonely, but it's mostly because, it's me and one of my colleagues that own the private practice, the group practice. But it doesn't feel as lonely because I have them, and because I've also been able to network and connect with a lot of therapists of color here in Los Angeles, which has been wonderful. And I have been hearing from a lot of folks who have been doing this for a long time that it wasn't like that before. And so that is nice to see, that there's definitely bigger networks of Latino, BIPOC therapists, queer therapists that get together now. I mean, even statistically, right, when I was in grad school, this was 2013, I was told that BIPOC folks and queer folks were actually the minority in the field, and that we were very small in terms of numbers. I think at that point, the statistic was that like 85 to 90 something percent of therapists were white. I remember sitting there thinking like, oh my gosh, like, how is that like possible, right? In the sense that we have so many people of color in this country and in the world. Obviously, we outnumber, right? The white population. But that's just to say, right, how the disparity exists even today. Because even though our numbers did increase, and I have seen a change, it's still not a lot, and it's still not enough for supporting communities of color that continue to grow in this country, every year. And so I think in that sense, it's definitely stayed the same, where we are often still the only ones and the first in many of these spaces, especially in leadership and higher up when it comes to mental health. And so it does show, right? Unfortunately, there is a other side of that. It means that we're not represented. It means that our voices are not often either taken seriously, heard, or taken into account. And it also means that the mental health field is still very much stuck in a very Western lens, very much clinical format that it does not work for everyone, right? And healing and therapy, I mean, therapy, the practice, I mean, these things are not new. They're old, right? They're things that have been used in lots of different cultures across the world in different ways, through ceremony, through rituals, through even conversation. These things have been around, right? And yet now that it's formalized, it's rooted in specifically, I mean, the way it was designed for the white population. And so I do think that in that sense, we are often still challenging those narratives and still fighting to really shift what mental health even means, right? Because even when we talk about mental health in this country, it's very different than the way it's seen in other places around the world. There's some norms here that are not norms in other places. And so for me, I like to really think about how these things have come to the forefront, whether it's through new theoretical orientations, like even microdosing or other forms, right, that focus more on meditation and the body. It is shifting from what it was originally. And that's because of other cultures and BIPOC folks and more diversity and more eyes coming into the field. But I've also seen, still a lot of people who are disappointed in the field, a lot of people who have pivoted to other careers like coaching or who have done other approaches in the same context, mostly because they're not happy with the way that the mental health field continues to push our voices out. And so you're right. I think that there's definitely growth. And at the same time, some things haven't changed and we're still working on that.
Right, right. I'm kind of curious about your experience, Luis, in terms of before you went into private practice, you were doing the thing, doing the thing that you were kind of in the mainstream, probably working in a clinic, or I don't know what kind of a facility you were working in. What was it in particular that was the impetus for you to get out? Like, what was there a straw that broke the camel's back? Was it more of an accumulation of things? What happened for you?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, that definitely was. I came into the field, I think it was around 2015 when I graduated. So around the middle of that year, I started my practicum. And I was at I don't think it's there anymore, but it was called the Pasadena Mental Health Center. And it was primarily there to support low-income community members and residents who didn't otherwise would not have access to therapy, and it was low-cost services. And I loved it. It was I think a lot more private practice modeled, where we were in a house, which was great because it felt very welcoming and cozy. And I remember seeing clients there and thinking, this is what I thought of therapy. Like something that felt, I think, more approachable, holistic, more welcoming. And so I loved my time there when I was doing my practicum. I think the introduction was really beautiful. But then right after, I had actually won a state stipend because, again, I was one of the only people of color in my program, had a 4.0, did really well, excelled, passed all my exams in the first time. I just really loved the work, and I was chosen for that stipend. But one of the requirements was that I had to work for a county. And so, at that point, I didn't know anything about what it meant to work in the county or what it even meant to provide mental health services in that capacity. And so I was excited, but also curious about what it would be like. I was thinking, it's going to be the same, like Pasadena. That was also a county services. But it wasn't. I actually went into what they called a high need program. So I was on call 24/7. I was working with a team of 4 people. I only had about 8 clients, but they were all very high risk. And so I was driving around LA, going into people's homes, being in very chaotic situations. And I did that for a year. And I remember thinking at the end of that year, like, oh my gosh, I don't think I chose the right field. I don't love this. Right. And it was mostly because not my clients, but the system. I was always headbutting with the expectations, the assumptions, the descriptions, the conversations that were happening behind closed doors about families. And, me coming in as a Latino, understanding a cultural side of it, I often felt very upset that the approach was so clinical, so cold, so distant. And here I was, as a therapist, but also having to be a coach, also having to be a case manager, also having to be coordinating constantly, and then having to, like I said, drive around. I spent most of my days driving around LA County, going to people's homes for an hour of mostly interrupted therapy because there was never privacy. I mean, that just wasn't the way people live. And so I did that. And I think by the end, I just felt so burned out and I was disillusioned, disappointed with the system. But I decided that I was going to relocate. And so I was done with my contract. I said, okay, I'm not going to stay. I'm done. I'm leaving. And an opportunity came up in San Francisco with another nonprofit that was specifically supporting Indigenous, Latino, and queer folks. That was just like their whole thing. And so I remember thinking, you know what, maybe this will be better. And I still wanted to work with children. I think that was originally the plan, was to go into this field and become like the child expert and just be this like wise, like almost Dr. Seuss like person in my head. I thought, oh, I'm gonna do this. And after that first experience, I was like, okay, I don't know if I love this, but I thought, you know what, I'm gonna give it another go. So I went there. Totally different experience. I was actually doing more work as a consultant, a mental health consultant. So I was still going places. I was going to schools, but it wasn't individual homes and it wasn't with high risk children or teens. It was specifically with Head Start programs and San Francisco County schools. So I was able to go in, educate the teachers, do workshops, work with the kids one-on-one, work with the parents. I fell in love with it. I really loved it because I think it reminded me a lot of my earlier years when I was a teacher before I decided to go into mental health. And I think it was bittersweet because I loved the work. That's the type of work I love. And at the same time, again, I saw a lot of the challenges that families were facing, the expectations. And I think after 3 years, it just became too much where I noticed it was having an impact on my mental health. I just thought, either I take a break or I continue. And I think at that point, I also thought, I've been working with kids now for almost 10 years, maybe more. Maybe I just need to pivot and start working with adults. And that was the moment where I got that opportunity because this space was specifically for queer, Latino, and Indigenous folks. That when I made the pivot, from families to working specifically with individuals, I fell in love with it again. I was doing the sessions. I was doing the work. I was having clients who I could relate to, who I could be a reflection for, who I could also identify with. And it made me feel empowered and comfortable. And I learned a lot from my clients. I always think back to that I learned so much from just working directly with clients than I ever did in like school programs or trainings or any of that. Just listening, just being more open, just, being client centered, I think really, really made me feel like I was falling in love again with the work I was doing, which, for a while felt like kind of like on and off. Like I love it some days, I hate it other days, but I fell in love with it again. And I ended up leaving that role because, again, there was so much expectation on me as the only queer therapist in that space. And it just, the expectation of seeing a certain amount of clients for not enough pay. And there was this almost like environment or attitude of self-sacrifice that I just could not really align myself with because I kept thinking, I'm also part of these communities. And as much as I love doing this work, I'm not doing okay, financially. I'm not doing okay mentally. And I think in that time, people had constantly talked about how for therapists, the big goal was to get to that 6-figure Kaiser job, cushy, like hospital job. And I thought, I'm going to go for it. I need to experience different environments. And so I did. I applied and I went in and did the whole thing. And I thought, this will be a great place. This will be a nice change. And there were definitely some great things about it, but it ended up being probably the worst experience I had as a therapist working in the field. That year at Kaiser, my gosh, I was depressed. I gained a lot of weight. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, which I had tried to avoid my whole life because it was something that was quite common in my family and it was seen in very negative light. When I finally got diagnosed, I remember feeling so disappointed and thinking, what is going on like in my life that I just, I can't even take care of myself. And it was just everything. I was working 8:30 to 5:30 p.m. every day, seeing about 6 to 8 clients a day for half an hour and then scheduling people a month out and getting yelled at by people, being, blamed for the services or for the quality when it wasn't me, right? I was working in an institution that didn't value the mental health department that they had created. I mean, and it's still ongoing. We still see a lot of strikes with Kaiser even now. It's still happening. And so for me, that was probably a trauma, I would actually now say it was a traumatizing experience because I never stepped foot in Kaiser again. And this was like 4 or 5 years ago. And I actually had them for my insurance even after, and I never went in. I could not step into that place because of the way that I was treated by management, but also because of what we just talked about, where there was this immense expectation on me as the only queer therapist of color and the only one who was specializing in sex therapy to see a huge amount of clients. And then at the same time, still constantly be told that they weren't doing enough, that it wasn't good enough, that, they needed to do more. The micromanaging, the dismissiveness, getting written up for things like going to a doctor's appointment because I was almost fainting and being told that wasn't an excuse, things like that I remember thinking like, well, that's no wonder I'm not taking care of myself. I'm being told I don't matter.
Right. Oh my goodness. Luis, the more that you share with me, I'm just like, oh my God, he's telling my story. It's so weird. So let me share something. I mean, almost the same thing. Like, I actually started out as a child and family therapist as well. And I was in systems. I was in a psychiatric hospital. I ended up at the Children's Hospital of Denver, gained about 50 pounds, had high blood pressure for the first time in my life, stressed out. I couldn't live with myself. I was the biggest bitch ever because I was so stressed. And I have an interesting question for you. And same kind of thing. The assumptions, the pressure, the expectations. Luis, how much of this do you think is just the system and it doesn't matter if your ethnicity? Or do you believe that this is something very specific or very specialized to people who are people of color? Like, these systems, do they treat us differently? Are the expectations different? Or is the system just really messed up?
Yeah, I'm going to say both because I do believe that the system as a whole is definitely a mess, especially the mental health care in this country. I mean, we already complain a lot about the medical care, but the mental health care is even, more disappointing because it's often not valued in the same capacity. And I have seen colleagues, whether white, brown, different ethnicity, queer or not, share with me how these systems are not helpful to clients or to us as providers. I've seen people switch careers or decide that they no longer want to do this work because it just felt like they were, it transformed into something else. And so I will say that I think systemically, yes, as a whole, when we talk about systems, there is a lot to be desired in the mental health system in this country. But I will also say that I think folks of color and queer people do experience a very different version of it. While they, everyone gets kind of like the shitty system, as they say, BIPOC folks and queer folks experience another side of that as well. I did hear from other colleagues who were not folks of color that were experiencing a lot of stress. However, the difference was that a lot of them, they had access to other things, whether it was like trainings or schools they went to, or whether it was also, I think not being questioned in the same way. Like I remember with me, when I would bring up the care, my supervisor would often say, well, this isn't community mental health. This is different. We're serving a different population. So, that if you don't like it, you can go back to working in the community. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like this is what an awful thing to say, right? And I remember sitting with that and thinking, like I noticed even the fact that I speak Spanish is being abused. I'm being paid 50 cents to $1 more for my skills, and yet I'm being given like a large amount of clients. There were often times where I didn't feel like I could say anything because I was seen as this problematic Latino queer person that was always bringing something up. My white counterparts were often a lot more agreeable or seemed to be very professional, as the word is used, whereas I was not. And I think I was getting angrier and more upset and more frustrated. And I had done that approach. I had tried to do the same approach. And I think many of us do that as well, right? We code switch into this idea of what's expected of us. I was wearing my ties. I was doing all of the things that I thought were professional, right? Even the way I presented, the way I spoke, and it didn't work. I still felt like I was being overlooked. I still felt like I had to work harder. And then when I was finally starting to be myself, there was pushback because I think there was a lot of assumptions that I was just someone that was not agreeable, or that I, was kept bringing up the problems with the system we were in. And I thought to myself, well, it's not that it's me, right? It's that I'm seeing this firsthand. I'm hearing it from my clients. I'm hearing it from other providers, who don't want to speak up for whatever reason. I'm feeling it, right? As a person, like you were saying earlier, I was totally irritable all the time. I felt like I had gained so much weight. I didn't feel good about myself. Mm-hmm. I already had a lot of shame, right? Having that type 2 diabetes, thinking, oh my gosh, this is a person of color thing. This is something that poor communities get. And I grew up in a very poor household, in a very poor community in LA and Inglewood. And so for me, a lot of those things were carried on over. I mean, the racism, the classism, all of that. And so I will say, yeah, it does impact us in a very different way, because we're constantly having to, carry this because of the way we look, because of the way that we approach things differently. And it's the same with any system, right? The people that are most vulnerable will always experience it very differently because they are living a very different life than others. And so I think I can firmly say, yes, as a queer person of color, I have experienced a worse side of the system.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is the biggest disservice? I think about psychology and I think about my own experience. When I went through graduate school, I was often the only person of color. And back in those days, you didn't talk about whether you were queer or gay. You were in the closet. I mean, I was in the closet for decades. And, being in a room predominantly white, and also having the experience of, you don't get this. Like for example, something that would really upset me is how they would pathologize. They would pathologize community values. Like, for example, this is not unusual in our culture. When I made the decision to go to college, I didn't go away to college. I didn't live on campus because I needed to take care of my family. I needed to take, my brothers were still teenagers, and I was, responsible for my brothers. And I remember having the experience of, I felt less than. I felt like they were judged. I was being judged for making this decision, or that my family was pathological. Like we were enmeshed, our boundaries were bad. And I'm curious, your experience, like, what do you think is the biggest disservice?
In my mind, the biggest disservice is that we don't allow and include these voices that are much needed to provide for the communities that need it most. But again, I do believe that is the way the system is designed, right? It is designed to overlook this. And I say that because even when we talk about mental health in general, the way that it's so formalized and clinical, right? We talk about diagnosing, we talk about the very formal, very distant, cold approach to therapy. I think that is not just an obvious example, but also a representation, right, of the way that this field got started. When we're talking about Freud, we're talking about earlier on, right, when the people that were able to access therapy were white folks. And that was the way that it worked, right? And I mean, it continued until later on we started to see that other people also needed that support. And the reality is that our communities had been already taking care of themselves, right? In the ways that they were able to, in the ways that they could. And back to what you just said, oftentimes these things were pathologized, right? They were seen as, not healthy or not clinically no evidence for it or whatever. It wasn't formalized until, we start to see that change, and we start to see how it is influencing the field in other ways. And yet we're still not represented. I mean, that's why there's so much pushback towards microdosing, right? Because these are things that indigenous people practice for a long, long time, hundreds of years. And now it's being taken in by the mental health field, but it's very white, and the people benefiting from it are mostly white. And we don't see people of color talking about this. We don't see indigenous people talking about it. Because again, like I said, it has definitely been a issue of gatekeeping and also control, right? The mental health field, like any other field, even with the intention of helping, is still very much rooted in systemic oppression, racism, classism, all types of isms. And so I do believe that the biggest disservice, which is intentional, is that we don't get to have a say. And what that means is that there's a lot of missing out on, so much abundance. I say that because I remember talking to a lot of my colleagues who practice therapy from a very different approach, used a lot of cultural traditional practices. I myself also utilize some of these. And we were often told, oh, that's not evidence-based. Oh, you're not supposed to utilize, that's not something that would work, blah, 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 or how do you know you're not causing harm to clients, right? Being questioned about the approach that we take, where there are lots of therapists that are non-folks of color that are also abusing or not really utilizing, these practices in a way that is beneficial to our clients. And yet people of color are often questioned a lot faster. And also this, dissuaded from taking on an approach outside of what is taught to them. And this starts in grad school. I remember going to grad school, and the first thing I was told was, you don't share about yourself. You don't, what was the word? Have you have a very specific relationship with clients. You practice from these modalities. I was trained to be very structured, to have this approach of almost like very medical. And it never worked for the clients that I worked with, because so many of them were struggling with just meeting their basic needs, that they were not there to sit down and have a conversation and talk about their mental health. They were being affected by everything happening around them. And so these are all things that I had to unlearn. And, in private practice, I've had the benefit of being able to decide what it is that I want to put out and how I want to work with clients within my scope, and also within my own purview of my knowledge and wisdom. And so that has made a huge difference. But that wasn't something that I was able to contribute in these other systems, because it wasn't welcomed and I wasn't allowed to do that. So I think that is the biggest disservice, is they're missing out on so much wealth of knowledge and so many things that we do know about our communities because we're part of them. And yet you have them trying to provide support for our communities without actually understanding them. And so it is frustrating to see that is the biggest disservice, is really not allowing the mental health field to evolve in the way that it needs to. And still seeing a lot of things stolen or taken. Even when I was reading about EMDR and I did the pre-certification thing, they talked a lot about how cultures around the world use rhythm and use eye movement and all this stuff. And yet when they credited it, it was a white woman that had introduced EMDR.
Wow.
And so I always thought that was so interesting. These systems are okay with taking our knowledge and our wisdom and rebranding it, but never really giving us that credit, right? To say that these things have been around, right? Because they weren't evidence-based before, or they weren't, openly embraced before, but now they are. Because I think if the goal is to make the mental health field and services move beyond, right, what it is, we have to decolonize that approach. And that is something that it means shifting the system, and the system does not want to, because it's designed to do what it's doing. So
Exactly. Well, and I think this is a great place to pivot a little bit. There's a lot going on in my mind as you're talking, Luis. So you jumped ship. I jumped shipped, by the way, as well. I jumped ship, and it's interesting to hear like the last 4 years going into private practice, and specifically, you have talked about your own approach of the psychosocial therapy, and I'm curious. Having the freedom to do what you want to do, having your own private practice, what are the things that you have done? Like, what have you focused on? What has evolved? What has grown now that you're not in these systems?
Yeah, I think what has grown for me is, one, me showing up authentically as I am, who I am. I show up to my sessions with my clients as a human. I don't hide behind the guise of professionalism or me having this power dynamic of knowing more than them. I show up as someone that, yes, I've had the education. Yes, I have the know-how of certain things. How can this help you? Or can it help you? So that's one way. Also, I've moved away from the idea of structuring and seeing people as diagnoses or seeing them as pathologies, and rather seeing them as human and people who have a whole history, a whole life, a whole mind, right, that gets impacted, like I said, by the world, by the systems at play. I educate myself, and I'm very much conscious of what is going on in the world, so that I can also hold these conversations and dialogue with my clients when they need to. I don't hide behind, my own behind a facade, right? If a client asks me a question, I'm very curious about how it would help them. I'm open to having that dialogue within that context, right? That's going to be supportive of them. I don't move away from indigenous and non-traditional practices. I welcome them in. I ask my clients, right, to guide me in what has worked for them, or anything that traditionally has been introduced to them by family, by whatever, right? Even if it's religion, all of it. And so I think in those ways, it is very different than what I used to have access to before. Also, as a sex therapist, I don't focus on the sexual dysfunction aspects of sex therapy, which is what I was primarily trained in. I focus on it from a social justice lens, where we talk about pleasure, trauma, culture, religion. We talk about bodies. We talk about relationship styles. We talk about so many things that move just beyond like the physical act of sex, because it does affect us in so many ways, even gender norms, sexuality, presentation, all of those things. And so all of that to me is crucial in this work, and are things that I do to really move away from what I was taught, while understanding, that being a part of this community gives me freedom to also practice and share things that I have learned that have been helpful for me, and helping my clients decide what is going to be best for them. One of the biggest examples I can think of is when I was growing up, I was trying to look for one, but my grandma used to bring these little dolls that are called quitapenas, and they're Mayan, and in Guatemala, they're very common. And I grew up with these little dolls like all around my house. And, my mom used to tell me, oh yeah, when you have a nightmare, you put it under your pillow. And I used to have them in my office because I just loved being reminded of my culture and my upbringing. And I remember there was a client that I was working with. This was still at Kaiser. And I was seeing them once a month for half an hour, and they were struggling with sleep. There was a lot of anxiety. And I remember they were sitting in my office and telling me, I don't know if this is working. I don't know if the therapy is helping because it's so infrequent. And we're just having a whole dialogue. And they took a deep breath, and they looked over at my desk, and they saw the little bow, and they asked me what those were. And I said, oh, I'm like, these are called quitapenas. They're dolls from Guatemala. I grew up with them. I explained the legend, right, about how Mayan adults used to give them to children, and they would put them under their, their pillow or whatever they laid their head on, and it was supposed to take away the nightmares and the anxiety. And I asked, "Can I gift you one? Can I share this with you?" And my client took it and got very teary-eyed and said that, they were very appreciative, and they thanked me for the gift and for thinking of them. And they took it with them. And I remember a month later, they came in and they looked completely different. They were dressed up. They looked very relaxed. And the first thing they said to me was, "Luis, oh my gosh, it worked." And I was like, "What worked?" They're like, the little doll you gave me, I put it under my pillow and I've been sleeping. And I sat there and I was like, "Oh my gosh," and I think in my head at that moment, I was thinking, this is it. It may, in my head, I think it was like, was it the doll? Like, the mystery of it. But what I realized was that it wasn't. What it was the connection, was the intention, was the outside the box. Like, we're not the sleeping list. What do you call it? The sleep hygiene list, not the CBT. It was this little act of kindness and me saying, I hope that you get rest, and it may work, it may not work. I remember when I was a kid, I used to use it and it made me feel better. And they came back and thanked me. And the interesting thing is that I visibly saw a month later the change. They didn't have bags under their eyes. They didn't come in their sweats. They were dressed up. They were smiling. And I remember thinking, this is really about the relationship aspect. This is really about also, not the traditional sense, right? Because a lot of people would have been like, "Oh, that's, a legend, or that's a story, or that's something silly, that's not something that's evidence-based." But to me, it was really more about understanding that my client was going through an experience and there was a lot happening, and what they needed was rest because they couldn't even be present. They couldn't focus. They were tired. And them telling me that they got better sleep and that was something that helped them made me realize that, I think for as much shame as I felt in that moment for even having given them the doll, because I was thinking, oh my gosh, am I going to get in trouble? Or are they going to say something to me for, one gifting? Because I remember being told, like, you don't accept gifts. You don't, dual relationships, this, you don't, don't. I mean, all the time that I honestly would feel very like stuck. Like I couldn't do anything as a therapist. I could just listen, analyze, give strategies and resources and move on. And it was that moment where I started to realize, like, no, this is not what I want to do. And this is not therapy. This is not the way that, my communities of color, and this was a client of color as well. So, after that, I think for me, there's been many ways in which I have unlearned, moved away from, and avoided getting stuck in the version of therapy that I was taught.
You're preaching to the choir here, Luis. I'm smiling on the inside. I remember like the first episode that we recorded with She Is Mother podcast. One of the things I said was, I'm an untherapist because I threw that shit away. And I said exactly the same thing you did. Is I learned when I went out on my own, and I got to do whatever the fuck I wanted to do. I learned that the most important part of what we do is showing up as our real authentic selves, and the magic happens in the relationship. We're trained, we're professionals, we have expertise, we have skills, and at the end of the day, those are just tools in a toolbox. The magic happens when we show up. And one of the conversations I had, and I'm curious what you think about this, is I feel like in our culture, our the American culture, our community today, what we have really lost is what I call almost like eldership. Like we don't have people that are a few steps ahead of us that are there as people, as role models, as mentors, as wise people to say, hey, I don't have all the answers, but I've been down this road and I might have something to help, but not only that, it's a relationship. We learn from our clients and we grow from our clients and we heal from working with our clients just as much as the other way around. And,
Absolutely.
I think that's beautiful. And the systems are just really missing out. They're missing out on the beauty of that and the magic of it and the power of showing up authentically and really honoring and embracing the value of the relationship. The relationship is the agent that heals.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've had the same experience.
Oh, absolutely. And I agree with you. I do think that is the most valuable piece, but it also requires time and patience and resources. And again, like I said, these are not things that these systems want to put into the mental health field. They don't value these things because what they're trying to create is something that is streamlined, something that is clinical, fast, direct. We did our part, move on, because it's all about the financial aspect of it, right? Which is, I mean, like I said, I think these are all things that are interconnected. And I absolutely agree with you that the biggest thing that has been helpful for me in the work that I do has been authenticity, not knowing all of these different theoretical orientations, not having all of these tools right in the toolbox. Those help immensely. But if I wasn't showing up as myself, if I wasn't even trying to build intentional relationships with my clients to create these spaces where they are able to do this work, then they're not going to help.
Right.
They're not going to help. And I've worked with therapists before myself as a client, right, where I've gone in and it's very much, this is how we're going to fix you. And it's never gone well for me. It's never felt good. It's never felt helpful. And I've gone to other therapists who listen and support and guide and are direct and, don't take on this persona, right, of the power dynamic of I know more than you. And it makes a huge difference. I've seen at least maybe 5-6 therapists since I started this work, because I'm also a firm believer that we need to go to therapy too. And we need that support because it is a lot of work. And it wasn't until last year when I started working with a queer therapist for the first time that even though I valued all of my previous experiences, this one was very different. I felt seen. I felt understood in a different way. I felt empowered, seeing someone that also came in with their nails done or makeup done, and they were just so open with me, and we talked about things that we both knew were realities. It allowed me to feel safe. It allowed me to feel like I could talk about these things. And so, like I said, I do think that there's power in us being in this field when we don't align with the status quo. There is, I think, a lot of exhaustion from BIPOC and queer therapists in this field, having to constantly challenge these things and still carry the weight of these experiences themselves, because they are a part of the community, right? They cannot escape that. We all don't get taught about in our grad programs. They don't teach us about how to start a business. They don't teach us about the cultural aspects. They don't teach us about, the other things I think that are important, right? Even indigenous practices, none of that. And so, like I said, I've had to do that on my own. I've definitely had to find my own path. And I've seen this field shift in lots of different ways, and it will continue to do that.
Right. You said something a little bit ago that I wanted to follow up on. And I think this is also where the traditional therapy model falls short, and this idea of wholeness. When you think about wholeness is all of who you are. You come, we all do, myself, you, anybody, we come to the table with these very complex kind of intersecting identities. We're not just a diagnosis. We're not just an ethnicity. We're not just a gender. We're not just a sexual orientation. We're very complex beings. And, be able to help and support, it's important to appreciate wholeness. And yet these systems, wholeness isn't even something that is talked about in these systems.
No, No, because like I said, they want the quick and go, right? Like
Yes.
bring someone in, give them this, give them tools, get them out. That's the most
Yeah.
common thing I've seen is get people in here, give them tools, give them coping strategies, and move along. And
Right.
that's what we can do. Whereas, for me, my experience in private practice has been completely different because when I start working with someone, it's not about fixing or identifying a problem. It's about getting to know who is this person? Why are they here now? What exactly is it that they want in life? What are things that they have achieved in life? Who are, what was their upbringing? What are the things that matter that don't matter? And like you said, that is literally building a relationship, right? Building an intentional connection. And so it does take time. And so even to that, right? Another thing that I've done in my practice is that I don't overbook myself. I have a very specific, very limited number of clients that I take on. I have my fees and I share with them. This is the reason because I know how important this work is. I do not overextend or stretch myself thin because I know that this work is sacred, because I know that this work is important. And so this is the way that I practice. And my clients know that and they value that. And I am very appreciative of that. And it has also helped me by, attracting the clients that do see the value in the work that I do and who do want to work with me. And I have been very successful in that path. And I am very proud of myself for that because I know that this is coming from the exhaustion of having to navigate all those other systems before and realizing that, I was only putting Band-Aids on a lot of these situations because I really couldn't do more, right? I've also connected in my network with other therapists of color attending events where there are folks who are practicing all types of beautiful, beautiful approaches that you don't often hear or see in the field because they are creating them themselves. I know I'm never a favorite when I'm in certain classes because even my sex therapy program, I was like, do we have any research on queer sex therapy approaches? Or oh, well, most of the research was actually done on cisgendered heterosexual white folks because this was back in the 70s. And I'm sitting there oh my gosh, we're in 2000 something. Why are we, what is going on? Even my supervisor, I remember butting heads with her. She was in Wisconsin. I don't know where she was. I can't remember anymore. And she helped me a lot. And also at the same time, we were constantly butting heads because she could not understand what I was talking about. When I was bringing in about issues and challenges that were very specific to queer folks, a response I would always get is, well, it's the same thing. Everybody has bodies. I'm like, no, it's not the same thing. That's not how it works. Having to almost educate other people that are supposed to educate me, right? That has often been my experience. I know private practice is not for everyone, and I don't glorify it in the sense that, it's the answer because it means a lot of sacrifices. It's also a lot of work. It's also very lonely. Yet for me, I have found that it has given me opportunities that I did not get in these other places. And while I'm not making the six figures that I was at Kaiser, I can say that I'm a lot healthier, happier, and in love with the work again.
Right.
So I think that has more value, at least to me.
That's good payment, right?
That's great. Yeah. I can see myself doing this for the next 20, 30 years, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah. You talk about being a late bloomer. You talk about coming into your own just recently. And I wonder if those things coincide, meaning when you jumped ship and said, I'm not doing this shit anymore, and you created your own lane and you decided to do what you felt was aligned with how to help others. I suspect that you also blossomed in that process by coming out of the box.
100%. That moment when I decided to take that leap, it was out of anger. It was out of frustration, disappointment. And I had learned from a close colleague before that to harness it. I used to be that person that would get so angry and I didn't really know what to do with it. I often felt very it was more destructive than constructive. And having this person that was a close friend and we had worked together for a while shared with me, Luis, the anger is so valid and it's so important, but what are you going to do with it? How are you going to use it to create and be constructive? That always sat with me. And even now it still sits with me because I remember that moment thinking I can just quit and I'm done and blah, blah, blah. And then I thought, no, you know what? I that's not what I want to do. I'm not going to quit because I feel like I've been disappointed. Like, what can I do to actually make this different? And so when I pivoted into that, other parts of me were also coming out. The part of me that was exhausted from having to hide myself and identifying as queer, but feeling scared of being myself because I didn't feel like people would take me seriously, or because of the stares, or because of people's judgments and criticisms. And fortunately, I had done a lot of work before that through therapy, and I was also in therapy at that point because of my struggles while I was working at Kaiser. That I think there was that moment of like realization of like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And so all of those intersections kind of came at a meeting, I would say. And then it was like, okay, I'm done. I'm leaving this. And it was a very fast, very painful, but also exciting change, because I knew that it was going to be a shift. I didn't have time to save. I didn't have time to plan. I had no business savvy. I didn't even know how to start this private practice. But fortunately, I did have people in my circle, people who loved me, that were there to help me, other therapists that I reached out to. I got the guidance. I launched my practice. And in that moment, I said, I'm not showing up the way I was before, because I was doing that in my head because that's what people were expecting from me. That's what I was told was professional, was acceptable, would get me, the respect, or how therapists are supposed to show up. And so that shifted in that moment. I remember going to my closet, getting rid of all the stuff that I had in there, all my ties and shirts and sweater vests that I hated wearing. And I always felt so like out of place for me. And I got rid of them, gave them away, donated them to Goodwill, and started to explore my own identity, because I thought, this is an opportunity for me. If I'm going to launch this private practice, this is not just a business. This is an extension of me. This is going to represent who I am as a therapist, but also as a human being. I remember even coming out as gay and thinking, oh, I'm gay, like I know what this means, right? This is my community, and still feeling very isolated, being told I was too feminine, being told that, I wasn't masculine enough like some of the other gay men, or that I was more I guess lots of different words and experiences that I had where I didn't feel welcome. I didn't feel like I was also one of the boys, It just didn't feel that way for me. And I known that my whole life, that I never fit into these gender constructs, that it wasn't that I was questioning myself in any way. It was more that I knew these things. I just kept hiding them because that I kept being told it's not okay, from a very young age, from my mom telling me, don't sit like that, don't talk like that, boys don't do that, boys don't like that color, boys don't yada yada, to hearing it socially, right, from the world, that this wasn't okay, that people like that get made fun of, or they're not valued in society. To me, internalizing that, and then in that moment say, no, I can't. I see so many amazing people out there who are being themselves, who are loving themselves, and I see how hard it is. I do see it. It's terrifying. And yet also, this is terrifying to me. This is exhausting to me. And I rather live authentically and deal with whatever comes than continue to do this and keep going on this path of me being miserable, having depression, being overweight, being tired, but all of these things, not because of, because of me just being, but because they were actual outcomes of the system that I was in that didn't, was not allowing me to be me. And so when I left, I started to really practice from a place of authenticity and really embracing myself. I learned to do so many things that I had not learned before. One of them was accepting myself and acknowledging that there was nothing abnormal about myself, that I was a human being who saw things very differently. I learned to embrace and love my body, which was always a struggle for me because I was constantly told, you're too short, you're too big, you're too this, even with my family, right, about the diabetes, that I started to really learn to love my body versus being aggressive and attacking it. And that made a huge difference, because then I started to decorate my body and feel good about what I was wearing and trying things out. And some were great. Some were like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I wore that, or whatever like that. But I loved the fact that I was able to do that I gave myself permission. And this was happening simultaneously as I was putting out my practice. And so they fused together in that way, where it wasn't Luis and therapist, it was like this one and the same. And I would show up like that to my sessions, and I would, be more open about my own journey. I started to talk about it more, and then people started to reach out and connect with me. I started modeling because I was so angry that, one of the reasons I hadn't gone into fashion or done creative work was because I didn't think that I would fit in. I didn't think that I would be welcomed, and I wasn't by a lot of these spaces. But I did it myself. I decided that I was still going to go for it. And so I did find people who did see me. The exciting thing has been that even though for a long time I thought, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm doing this just now. I should have done it when I was younger. Like that late bloomer, I think almost like guilt of not realizing this earlier kept crawling in. And then I realized, no, I needed all of that time to get to where I am now, because now it's fast tracked. I can't even believe it's been 4 years. I've been looking at videos from 4 years ago. I've been connecting with friends from, years ago, and they'll share with me, Luis, you look happier. Luis, you look like you're enjoying what you're doing. And I sit there and I think, I am. I do feel good. And I gotten better at setting boundaries. I've gotten better at not worrying about what others think. I've gotten better at finding empowerment. And that's what I want for others. That's why I did this, because now it's almost like as my practice goes into its 5th year, it's almost like I've been growing with it myself. Like we've been growing together. My practice is growing along as a business, but also me as a human. I almost feels like going back into a yearbook and being like, oh my gosh, like, wow, you have changed. And it's change that's been so beautiful because it was intentional. It wasn't out of how can I align and achieve and succeed in all the ways that you've been told, but it was getting rid of that and thinking, how can I be happy and find joy and love myself and embrace myself? And that made a huge difference. So I will say, yeah, it definitely has intersected. There was no way for me to be the therapist I am today without also becoming the human that I am today.
And that's so beautiful. I mean, you're such a beautiful example and expression of what this is all about, Luis. I mean, I'm sitting here taking this in and I'm thinking about the contrast. And, this isn't even just about us being therapists or us being mental health providers or supporters. This is a message for everybody in the sense of the contrast when you were in the systems and you were trying to be what they wanted you to be. And there were these expectations and the assumptions, and you had to fit in this box. You had to wear the ties and the sweater vests. You were dying, you were depressed, you were unhappy, you were angry, you were unhealthy. And then you jump that ship and you take your own lane, you create your own space, you do what you believe is the right thing. You do what is aligned with who you are, and then you grow and you expand and you fill, your purpose. And you become it's not even that you become who you are. You already always are who you are, but you allow yourself to fill up that space and you show people. You don't tell people, you show people, here's the way. When you accept who you are, when you live who you are, when you live in that wholeness, that is where happiness is. That's where joy is. And that's where it's almost magical, right? Isn't it almost magical?
It is. And I thank you for saying it that way. I got so emotional as you were saying it, because even my work, like on social media, I've seen it grow over time because I have shared this journey on there. And people would often say, oh my gosh, you're an influencer. You're an influencer. And I would laugh and be like, no, I consider myself more of an inspirer. I want to inspire people to be who they are, not to tell them to be like me, because no one is like me. People are all different and we're all going to shine in our own magic. And it is very magical. I think the idea of liberation and moving away from these constructs that just keep us in cages is very powerful. And so for me, even my work on social media, it's not about telling people dress like me, be like me, do what I did. No, it's about telling people, this is what I've done. This is how it's helped me. What do you need? What is going to help you? What are some of the things that are holding you back? Because they're not the same. And that's okay because they're not meant to be the same. So my work is really centered on giving people, this nudge to throw down the cage, right? To get out of the box, to start to question things, to be curious about the things they've been told versus the things that they actually want and the life that they actually want. Because for me, I realized that I was the one locking myself in, but it was for a reason. I wanted to be loved. I wanted to be embraced. I wanted to be safe. And I realized that the more that I did that, the less I was of any of those things. And so finding liberation was what actually gave me that. And it was a very scary journey. I was terrified at first that my partner was going to think, oh, they changed so much. Are they still going to love me? I thought when they met me, I was this young, guy in college and trying very hard to fit in and dress very differently and thinking, now I realizing and accepting that I don't abide by that I don't want to dress like that. I don't want to look like that. I don't want to exist that way because it's not who I am. I was worried about that, about rejection. I thought, is he going to love me? And thankfully, he was the one that went shopping for lipsticks with me when I first decided I wanted to wear makeup, and he was trying them on me and telling me what he loved and what he hated. He was the one telling me, yeah, no, let's go shopping, and just being there for me. And I think that made a huge difference. And I completely understand from that perspective how love and finding the people that do see you and appreciate you make a world of difference. I wasn't able to do that with my family. I'm still not. And although it breaks my heart and it brings me pain, I realized that I have found so many amazing people who love me, who check in on me, who, root for me, who hype me up, who make me feel great about the work I'm doing, who I can collaborate with, who I can create with as well. People who can have deep conversations and not hide behind the superficiality, right, of these expectations that we hold on ourselves. And that has liberated me even more, right, to see that. And I think that in my mind, when I work with any client or when I'm talking about these things, I remind people that it did not happen overnight. It took years. It took survival. It took really difficult moments that I still hold because I do get constantly reminded, by people's looks, people's judgments, comments, the idea that I do live in a world where in my lifetime, it may not be to that point of not even having to prove something, right? Where I can just live. But unfortunately, that's not the world I live in. And being queer and being a person of color and being the first is still a very rough path. But I'm okay with it now because I found joy along the way, and I found others who, don't let me slip on that path. And that has made a huge difference. So when people look, it's not the same that it was when I first started to be myself, because now I know who I am. I look back, I smile. I remind myself that I'm not here to be liked or appreciated by others. I see it as an opportunity to also help other people see someone that is not living in the way that they're expected to, but living in the way that they want to. And hopefully, that little moment, and it's so fascinating because I think about it all the time when I see people look at me, they have this look of almost trying to make sense of me, almost trying to put me in a box. And I see their brain working where they're almost like devil, like this look. And to me, when I think about that, it used to bother me. And now it gives me some comfort thinking there are people out there and they're probably looking at me wondering, okay, cool. let's move on. And it's fine. And I've had people come up to me and tell me, you look so beautiful, or I love your outfit, or hey, you're so confident. And I always laugh to myself because I think it takes so much strength sometimes to just show up. But I realize that people are watching, and I'm not doing it for that intention. But I also know that sometimes other people need it too. And I've had those people come up to me and say, thank you for letting me know that I can also be myself. And to me, that means so much because no one ever said that to me when I was growing up. So I think everything happens for a reason. And I'm glad that it took me years to get here, because now I'm in a place where I am safe, where I'm taking care of myself, where I have my career, where I don't depend on, my family for that support, where I don't have to worry about these things. But like I said, it took a lot of time. And so I always work with clients from where are you at and what do you need right now? Because you will not always be here. You
Right.
will move past this, and then you will get more opportunities, and you will only grow from here. And so I help them identify, I help them find, I help them feel aligned with who they really are in the ways that are safe and healthy for them in the moment. And then just remind them that all of it is a part of a process. And if you trust in it, the way that I did, even though I was terrified, it does pay off.
Sure, it does. It does. And there's a couple of things I'm thinking about. One is you are becoming the role model that you needed, when you were in graduate school or a young person, you're becoming that. And it's important because, first of all, I think it's so crazy when you really think about this, Luis. It's crazy that we just can't be who we are. It's like, when you really think about that, the world that we live in wants us to be in boxes. Mm-hmm. And boxes, they kill us. They can literally put us into this path of slow death, because we are meant to be our fullest expression of ourselves. So I think it's crazy that we're even having to have the conversation, that we have these journeys that are very painful and hard. And there's struggle, and it's the journey to allowing ourselves to be who we are. And the fact that you're doing this is such a gift to the world. It's because there is somebody watching or listening to this that needs this, to see that it is such a courageous and brave decision to make, to be who you are and not make yourself be in a box. And I think that's so important. I think it is so important. Yeah. And it's attached to mental health, right? It's attached to our wholeness. It's attached to our health.
It is. It definitely is. It definitely is. And, that resistance, right, of choosing ourselves and choosing to be seen is honestly a gift to the world. Mm-hmm. It is a gift. I did a reel not too long ago where I was talking about gender and how a lot of indigenous cultures and other cultures around the world, did not align with what the current idea of gender is, right? A very Western, very religious based, very much rooted in colonization, and how it was very different. And there was a point where queer people who were different, were valued for their wisdom and for the gifts that they brought, and from their ability to see beyond, binaries and things in one specific way. And the historical information on that says that when colonization happened, a lot of the colonizers that were here wanted to ensure that they had control. And so the way that they did that was by introducing gender norms and religion and roles, right, about who was what. And a big part of it was also ownership of women, right, that women were less valued in these societies, and they were seen as property. And so these ideas were introduced to control also natives, right, and for value and for, data, right, all of these different approaches. And so when they saw that there were people that did not align with that, they were seen as threats, because these were people who did not want to fall into a box, and also who they saw as against the religion that they were teaching versus different. And so there was a lot of erasure, and I think that's something that many people don't know. And oftentimes I hear folks who will say to me, oh, all this new stuff happening now, all these like people saying this, like, it's so interesting. I wonder what happened. And I'm like, it's not new. It has been around forever. The difference is that now we're starting to see people who are not afraid anymore, who are fighting. And it is a scary time, because we are living right now in a time where the rhetoric is once again, queer people are not good, right? They're being demonized. They're being attacked. And when you take into consideration what you said earlier as well, the intersectionality of it all, the people affected the most are queer, BIPOC, people of color, just people with disabilities, folks who are neurodivergent. I mean, lots of other people in that are most vulnerable in the LGBTQ plus community because they get the short end of the stick, right? And so I think that also we have to consider who in the LGBTQ plus community is being targeted, and that's trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming people. For the same reason that they are not falling in line into what these narratives have taught us, because they're different, right? There is this expectation that no, this is the way it has to be, and this is deeper than that. This goes back into everyone, because we're being told how men are supposed to act, how women are supposed to behave, and pushing these ideas right on us again, or the same thing, control. And this is not to say that everyone is, gender nonconforming or queer or any of that. No, this is to say that there are people that do exist this way, and we're being told no. And the fact that we're being told no also affects the people that don't identify this way, because men are being told they shouldn't cry. Men are supposed to toughen up. Men are supposed to, be this and that. Women are supposed to be this and that, right? Like, you're supposed to behave this way. So it goes beyond that, because we can't even be people. We're not allowed to be human. Men are not allowed to be human. Women are not allowed to be human. And that is the message. And so, like I said, this is, again, a repeat of even earlier colonization, where queer people were around and they were seen as a threat because they were challenging the systems that was being brought in. This is another reincarnation of that, right? Of, trans and non-binary people, there's a mental illness. I mean, they've already tried to diagnose us with mental illness. They've already tried to, legally, right, change what gender means. They've already done the science, the research, all that bias stuff that was never accurate, that was utilized and weaponized. And we're seeing it again. So for me, that's, again, me existing in itself is challenging that, is rejecting that. It's resistance. And that is what queer people do, right? When they exist as themselves, they're saying, this is who I am, and this is how I live my life. And I want to live just like everyone else. And so I think that's why it's so important, and even beyond visibility, right? Because there's so much more that needs to happen now, because politically, right, this is no longer just about thoughts and views and perspectives. It's about real situations, right? Rights being taken away, people being targeted, discriminated. This leads to violence. This leads to, death, right? Like, we can still look at statistics now, and they are still the same when it comes to LGBTQ plus youth, homelessness, substance use, being kicked out of your home, right? Violence towards us. It is still the same. So no, we're not past that. And so I think that's why it's so important to recognize that we are all, on this journey together, that my liberation is also other people's liberation.
Well, and thinking about that, Luis, you said that you're going to be 39. What would you today, if you were sitting next to your 20-year-old self, what would you tell your 20-year-old self?
Oh my gosh, I have like so many things I would probably say to them. I would say to them to not worry about a timeline, to not worry about getting to things so rapidly, that life is very beautiful and also very bitter, and things happen when they need to happen. I think my 20-year-old self was so focused on this idea of success because they wanted to make their parents proud. They wanted to be accepted by society. It was always about everyone else, that I would tell them it's okay to not have to be seen the way that others want you to be seen. but instead to give yourself the time and go through the heartbreak, go through the painful moments, go through the disappointment, because it'll only remind you that you were right all along and that it wasn't about what others wanted for you. It was really about what you wanted. Because even at 20 years old, when I think back to that person, I remember thinking that where I'm at now is really what I wanted. But it was too scary for me to think about it. It was too scary for me to fantasize about a life I could have, because I didn't think that I could. I didn't even think I would get past 30. I was still hiding and scared and stuck. So I would tell them that, to not rush themselves, that it'll be okay.
Right. And what do you tell somebody? Because it is a real thing, and I want listeners to hear this. I think this is really important. This is hard. It's not rainbows and butterflies. Violence is real. Aggressions are real. And it takes a tremendous amount of courage to be who you are, and it doesn't guarantee that bad things can happen. And so when somebody could be listening to this and they're really terrified of stepping into who they are, what would you tell that person that's really scared?
I would tell them that to be themselves, there is no way to do any of this. I think there's often times where people think that they have to full on, right, make all of these changes and jump into this other space. But like I said, this is something that takes time. Yes. What are the things that you do have control of right now? For me in that moment, I needed to find that emotional, physical safety. And I did with my partner, and also with myself, being in a place where I could make bigger decisions. I had finished my degree. I had gotten to a place where I had options. And that, like I said, it took time to get there. But when I did, I was able to make other changes. And so to see this as something that does take time, that we don't have to rush into finding and knowing ourselves completely. We're going to spend the rest of our lives doing that. But it's really just about starting now, right? Like I said, where are we at right now? What can we do? And I see people doing this in so many different ways, whether it is, just aligning more with just the way they present, whether it is with them having that conversation with people they love, or finding people that do see them and appreciate them, whether it is getting the information, right, and going to support groups or going to LGBTQ plus centers, or even just like watching things that make them feel inspired. I have seen it with people who, are starting therapy, right, and want to start talking about it. Like I said, there is no way or blueprint to be this, because that is what makes it so exciting and so scary, that it's very unique to each of us. Right? I cannot tell people how to do things that are going to get them to this place, because I don't know what it looks like for them. What I can share with them is how I did, and hopefully there's something that does help. And also I can listen and I can support and I can be someone that, like you said earlier, right, chooses to live their lives authentically, so that others, maybe people who are just getting there, can at least see like, oh, there's other people that look like that. There are other people who live this way and are finding some way, so that they can also start to think about ways for themselves, right, that are going to get them there. I had a client who asked me the same question, and they asked me like, what would you recommend? And I said, well, tell me one thing that you've thought about that you maybe haven't done because it was scary. They're like, oh, I have these rainbow earrings I wanted to wear, but I've been scared because I know the symbol that they represent. And I'm like, okay. I'm like, well, is there anyone that, is there a situation, right? Like assessing for safety, is there a situation where it would be scary? Oh, well, maybe this or that, right? And we literally had a whole conversation about this. And I remember the next session they came in with the earrings, and they told me that they had worn them to work and they felt so good because they got so many compliments from people, and they didn't have to give out their whole story. They didn't have to share their personal life. All they did was wear something that made them feel proud of who they were, and they knew, and that's what mattered. And they were so happy about it. And I think about that because even in that small way, they were affirming themselves. They were embracing themselves by wearing these rainbow earrings that they specifically got because they identified as part of the LGBTQ community, and they wanted to feel proud about it. And so that small gesture was huge for them. And so that's what I mean by we all have to start somewhere. For me, like I said, it was getting a lipstick. I mean, I went a little bold, I started thinking I was a makeup artist early on, which was not the case. But that was for me. I was tired. I was ready to dive in that way. But I had been doing it in other forms before. I by tapping into my creative side, by picking colors that were not usually like the norm for me, by challenging people when they made ignorant comments, by doing little things that, at first were just a way for me to really build. To get to a place where I did feel empowered and I did feel good, where I could say no. And even 4 years ago, where I'm at now is totally different. It is totally different because even when I was brave enough to do it then, now I know what I like, what I don't. Now I know how to take care of myself in ways that I didn't before, setting my boundaries and limits, being very direct. Protecting myself and accepting that it's okay for me to still feel anxiety, that it's okay for me to still feel confused about some things, that it's okay for me to not have all the answers. These were things that they sound so easy, but they were not things that I understood before. And so for me, that is what I mean, that it takes time, that we have to build up to it. And we're already doing it, right? I think people underestimate what they're doing to just survive, which is crucial to move into this space of thriving. Because to get there, we have to be able to be okay first.
Right. Yes. And I love that. I love that, there's no timeline. It's not, we're not behind, right? We're never behind. We didn't miss something, this is the path. This is the path to becoming who we are. And, just trust the process. The process. Luis, the mental health field needs more people like you and me. They need more. They need more because I think what's really important is at the end of the day, we are who we are. There's nothing wrong with us. And it's great to have the support that we need to find those parts of ourselves that we've disowned because we've been told that they're not okay.
Absolutely. And never in my life when I was younger that I think I'd be sitting here chatting with you, Dr. Arellano, and two queer people talking openly about their experiences. I didn't. I honestly, like I said, I didn't think I would get past 30. I was terrified of what it meant to be queer because it was not safe. Right. And I realized now that my biggest priority then was to find safety. And I've met so many queer people along the way that were doing it. And each of them gave me an ounce, a moment, a memory of times where I wanted more and more to be myself until I got there on my own. And I needed that time. So, like I said, I never expected to be sitting here speaking to someone who, is doing this work and also a mentor, right, in that way. Because I didn't see that growing up. I didn't have that. So to me, that is part of that honor, is being able to now find people who are also going through this process. And you didn't need to, say it out loud from the beginning. You have been figuring it out and living it. And for you to say that, I think it's so important because it is a great reminder to people out there that we need to survive. We need to figure things out. And then when we do, it's so much faster after that moment, because once we say, this is who I am, it's hard, but it's also liberating at the same time. And I know for myself, from that moment 5 years ago, I haven't looked back, and things have felt brighter because I have been able to make all the changes I needed to to build the life that I did want.
And you're on the right track for yourself when you're aligned, because the experience is joy. Joy is the thing that tells you where you need to be, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, Luis, this has been great. I really appreciate you taking the time to meet with me and with the audience. And I'm hoping that this is going to be helpful to a lot of listeners. And, you keep being you. I think it's so important for you to lead this way. You're absolutely right. Both you and I, and we're not alone. We've had the experience that there's nobody that's been in front of us. We haven't had anybody paving the path for us. We haven't had role models. We haven't had people that are like us, to show us the way. And we've had to pave our own way. And, the world needs more people like us that are courageous and willing to say who we are and to say it proudly and boldly. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a wonderful conversation. And likewise, I hope that people take something from this. It doesn't have to be everything, but something that resonates and connects and that helps inspire, and that they use it to find their own path or to continue on their own path. That's always my hope.
Yes. Thank you.